A pair of high heels sits abandoned on the shoulder of a dark road. Nobody's wearing them. A few hundred yards away, in the middle of an empty field, a leather purse lies open in the dirt, its contents untouched. No one ever tried to steal a single thing inside it. Whoever left these things wasn't robbing anyone. They were getting rid of evidence, piece by piece, and hoping the South Texas countryside would swallow the rest. 5 days later, a search team wades into an irrigation canal on the edge of McAllen, Texas, and finds a 25-year-old schoolteacher floating face down in the water. She's still fully dressed, except for her shoes and her underwear. Her blouse has been torn open. The autopsy will show she was beaten with something hard and heavy, sexually assaulted while she was unconscious, and then suffocated to death. Her name is Irene Garza. She was a second-grade teacher, a former beauty queen, the first Latina drum majorette at her old high school, and 4 days before she died, on the Saturday before Easter, she walked into her church for evening confession and was never seen alive again. Here's the part that's going to make your blood boil. Within days, police, prosecutors, and church officials all privately agreed on exactly who did it. A letter would later surface, written by a priest to another priest 3 months after the murder, laying out an actual plan to get the suspect out of Texas before the opponents of the church could make a scandal out of it. And it worked. For 56 years, it worked. The man everyone quietly believed killed Irene Garza got to leave the priesthood, get married, raise 3 kids, and grow old in Arizona, while her family spent half a century watching absolutely nothing happen. Think about the sheer scale of that for a second. 56 years is longer than most marriages last. It's long enough for a suspect to become a father, then a grandfather, while the woman he was suspected of killing never got to become either. It's long enough for an entire town's worth of witnesses, officials, and church leaders to grow old and die themselves, taking whatever else they knew to their own graves, while one man kept walking around free. This is the case that took an entire American institution 56 years to stop protecting one man. And when justice finally came, it came from an 85-year-old walking into a courtroom with a cane. I'm going to walk you through exactly how a small Texas town covered up a murder for over half a century, and exactly how it finally came apart. If you're new here, this is Cold Case Explained, where we break down the cases that took decades to crack. Subscribe before we get into it, because the cover-up in this one goes higher than you think. McAllen, Texas, April 16th, 1960. Easter weekend in a small, deeply Catholic border town where the church isn't just a building people visit on Sundays. It's the actual center of civic life, tangled up with local politics, local business, and pretty much every family's sense of respectability. In a town like this, the parish priest isn't just a religious figure. He's someone whose word carries weight in rooms far beyond the church itself. Irene Garza is 25 years old. She teaches second grade at Thigpen Elementary. 3 years earlier, she was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. She's devout, well-liked, engaged to be married, and remembered by everyone who knew her as the kind of person who set an example. Her younger cousin, Sylvia Acevedo Stern, who grew up next door with Irene's parents as her godparents, would spend the rest of her own life describing Irene as someone she looked up to and tried to emulate. On the evening of Holy Saturday, Irene leaves her family's home to attend confession at Sacred Heart Catholic Church before Easter Mass the next morning, a completely routine act of faith for a woman like her, the kind of errand nobody thinks twice about. She never comes home. What happened inside that church in the next 20 minutes has never been fully and consistently explained by the one man who was there. The priest hearing confessions that night is a 27-year-old visiting cleric named Bernard Feit. When Irene's family reports her missing and investigators start asking questions. Feit tells them he heard her confession in the main sanctuary, like everyone else that night. But this detail is about to matter enormously, because within days, under further questioning, Feit changes his story. He now says he actually heard Irene's confession privately, back in the church rectory, a face-to-face confession, which was highly unusual for the time and place. He explains his sudden absence from the sanctuary that night by claiming he broke his glasses and had to step away, something he says he does nervously while listening to confessions. Investigators note the contradiction. They also note something else. Father Feit has visible scratches on the backs of both hands, the kind of marks that don't come from handling a rosary. Word spreads fast in a town this size that Irene Garza never made it home from confession. Volunteers begin organizing before the sun is even up the next morning. What nobody in McAllen knows yet, what won't come out for years, is that this isn't the first time in recent weeks a priest matching Feit's description has been accused of attacking a young woman inside a church. Irene's disappearance triggers what becomes, at the time, the largest volunteer search effort the Rio Grande Valley has ever seen. Hundreds of people fan out across McAllen and the surrounding countryside. Neighbors, students Irene had taught, strangers who'd only ever seen her photograph in the local paper. Investigators carry out nearly 50 separate polygraph examinations over the course of the search, questioning anyone who might have crossed paths with her that night. A reward is posted, $2,500 at first, an enormous sum for 1960 coin, and larger than any reward ever offered in a Rio Grande Valley murder case up to that point, later boosted to $10,000 by local businessmen desperate to bring her home. The search doesn't take long to start turning up pieces of her, and each discovery makes the picture worse. Her high-heeled shoe is found abandoned near an empty road, sitting alone in a way that makes clear she didn't simply lose it while walking. Her purse turns up in the middle of a field, its contents completely undisturbed. No cash missing, nothing rifled through. That detail matters enormously to investigators because it tells them immediately that whoever did this wasn't a robber looking for money. This was something else entirely, something far more personal and deliberate. 7 weeks might have felt like the ending of this story to some other family. For the Garzas, it takes 5 agonizing days. 5 days of not knowing, of hoping against every instinct that she'd simply gotten lost or hurt, or was being held somewhere and could still be found breathing. On April 21st, a search team finds Irene's body floating face down in an irrigation canal on the edge of town. She's fully dressed, except for her shoes and her underwear. Her lavender blouse has been unbuttoned. The autopsy that follows is brutal reading. She'd been struck with a hard, blunt object, sexually assaulted while unconscious, and ultimately suffocated to death. Near the canal, investigators recover a candle holder from Sacred Heart Church itself, the kind of object that could easily produce the blunt force injuries described in the autopsy, and the kind of object that doesn't wander a mile from its own sanctuary by accident. They also recover a small photo slide viewer at the scene, an object that will resurface and be fiercely contested. Nearly 6 decades later, in a courtroom, neither the searchers nor the family could have imagined that day. Within days, investigators are already circling back to the priest who changed his story about where he heard her confession. Here's where this case turns from a tragedy into something far darker, because it turns out John Feit wasn't a mystery to investigators at all. 3 weeks before Irene Garza disappeared, a young woman named Maria America Guerra had been attacked inside a church in nearby Edinburgh. A man grabbed her from behind in the dark and tried to suffocate her. She fought back hard enough to bite down on her attacker's finger until she tasted blood, and he fled into the night. Investigators would soon find out just how close that pattern came to repeating itself in the worst possible way. When police eventually put together a lineup, both Maria Guerra and a separate witness who'd seen a man leaving the church that night identify the same person, Father John Feit. Investigators note that Feit was seen in the days after the attack with a visibly injured finger, bearing what witnesses describe as teeth marks, which he explains away as an injury from a mimeograph machine. Beatriz Garcia, a young woman who'd had her own bizarre encounter with Feit in the weeks before Irene's murder, would later testify that Feit once stopped her on the street and asked whether he could photograph her dressed in black near the cemetery. Feit is administered a polygraph test regarding both the Guerra assault and Irene Garza's murder. The polygraph examiner's own report is damning. It states plainly that the subject was not telling the truth when he denied attacking Maria Guerra or killing Irene Garza. Decades later, that same examiner would say publicly that the test result should have been reported as an outright failure. But at the time, in a heavily Catholic community in 1960, that's not how it gets treated. Early reports on the test even suggested, falsely, that Feit had passed, a discrepancy that itself raises uncomfortable questions about who was shaping the official narrative, even in those first chaotic days of the investigation. Feit stands trial for the Guerra assault in 1961, more than a year after Irene's murder. The jury deadlocks, unable to reach a unanimous verdict, even on the lesser charge tied to an attack Guerra herself had witnessed and survived. Rather than risk a retrial, prosecutors accept a plea. Feit pleads no contest to a reduced charge of aggravated assault, pays a $500 fine, and serves 0 jail time. It's a resolution that, in hindsight, looks less like justice and more like the first move in a much longer pattern of minimizing what this man had actually done. And then, remarkably, nothing happens with Irene Garza's case at all. No charges, no indictment, no further public action of any kind. A 25-year-old woman has been beaten, sexually assaulted, and suffocated to death. And the last man who saw her alive, a man 2 separate people have already identified as a violent attacker, a man who failed a polygraph specifically about her murder, simply walks away. For decades, people in McAllen quietly wondered whether some kind of deal had been struck. Irene's own aunt, Herlinda de la Viña, would later put it simply, in an interview she gave decades after the murder. Who were we to question a priest? That single sentence tells you almost everything about why this case sat frozen for so long. Not because nobody suspected the truth, but because an entire town had been raised to believe questioning a priest wasn't something ordinary people were allowed to do. But wondering is very different from proof, and proof, when it finally surfaces decades later, is almost unbelievable. Decades later, during pre-trial preparation for Feit's eventual murder case, prosecutors subpoena records from the religious order Feit belonged to, the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. Buried in that file is a typed letter, dated August 1st, 1960, just over 3 months after Irene's body was found, written by a priest named Father J.F. Paulicki to the head of his order's southern region, Father Lawrence Seidel. The letter never names Feit directly, but it doesn't have to. It recounts advice the author says he received directly from the local sheriff, that the prosecution's case was weak, and that officials needed a plan to protect the church before things went public. The letter recommends hiring a private investigator to find loopholes in the state's case, and urges getting the suspect out of the area entirely. In the letter's own chilling phrase, the goal was to get him out of the area of suspicion, while noting that the longer time we have, the weaker the case gets. Read that last line again. That isn't a description of an investigation losing momentum naturally. That's a strategy, written down in a church's own internal correspondence, for deliberately running out the clock on a murder case. That plan works exactly as intended. Feit is quietly transferred to a series of monasteries outside Texas. Investigators later find that his personnel files, the kind the church is required to maintain under its own internal canon law, simply cannot be located at either his old seminary or the diocese that had overseen his post in McAllen. Files that should exist, by the church's own rules, don't. A man 2 witnesses had identified in a violent assault, who'd failed a polygraph tied directly to a murder, disappears into the church's own internal transfer system instead of a courtroom, and the paperwork that should have followed him simply vanishes along with him. Meanwhile, a Hidalgo County reporter named Darrell Davis, 20 years old at the time, later a practicing lawyer, sits in on an off-the-record meeting where he will testify decades later under oath. The sitting district attorney openly acknowledges that both prosecutors and church officials already know Feit killed Irene Garza. The plea deal in the Guerra case, Davis says, was struck specifically in exchange for the church agreeing to discipline Feit privately and remove him from Texas for good. And there's a political angle too, one that makes this cover-up even more calculated. 1960 is the year John F. Kennedy, a Catholic candidate for president, is campaigning nationally, and some officials reportedly worried that a scandal involving a Catholic priest in a heavily Catholic town at exactly this politically sensitive moment could do real damage well beyond McAllen. The local sheriff, up for re-election that same year, had his own very practical reasons to want this story to disappear quietly and quickly. Whatever the exact mix of motives, the outcome is the same either way. Institutional self-interest wins, and Irene Garza's case goes cold. Not because the evidence ran out, but because the people with the power to act on it made a calculated decision not to. It's worth pausing on just how many separate institutions had to quietly agree to look the other way for this to work. A police department that stopped pushing, a district attorney's office that never filed charges, a sheriff worried about his own re-election, and a church hierarchy willing to treat a murder investigation as a public relations problem to be managed rather than a crime demanding accountability. It didn't take one villain. It took an entire small town's worth of powerful people, each deciding individually that silence was easier than the alternative. The case sits frozen for over 40 years. Feit leaves the priesthood in the early 1970s, marries, raises 3 children, and settles into a quiet life in Scottsdale, Arizona, working an ordinary job and, by every outward appearance, living completely unremarkably. A grandfather by the time anyone comes looking for him again. Then, in 2002, McAllen's police chief, Victor Rodriguez, decides to reopen the case, bringing in the newly formed cold case unit of the Texas Rangers, led by Ranger Rudy Jaramillo. And almost immediately, 2 men who'd once been priests come forward with testimony that should have ended this case on the spot. What they were about to say had apparently been sitting, unspoken, for nearly 40 years. The first is Dale Tashaney, a former monk who had once been responsible for counseling Feit at a monastery he'd been transferred to. Tashaney tells investigators that Feit privately confessed to him not long after the murder, describing in detail how he'd restrained Irene Garza in the church rectory, sexually assaulted her, and disposed of her body in the canal. Tashaney would later describe the psychological weight of carrying that confession for decades, at one point telling investigators simply that he can't breathe when he thinks about what he'd kept silent about for so long. The second is Father Joseph O'Brien, who had served as assistant pastor at Sacred Heart itself back in 1960. O'Brien tells Texas Rangers that Feit made a similar admission of guilt directly to him, and O'Brien adds a detail of his own. He remembered noticing conspicuous scratches on Feit's hands after midnight mass, right around the time Irene disappeared. Two separate men, from two separate parts of Feit's life, independently describing the same confession, decades apart, with no apparent way to have coordinated their stories. Investigators bring their findings to then District Attorney Irene Garza in 2003. And Garza presents the case to a grand jury the following year. The grand jury fails to indict. Read that back. Two witnesses with direct, independent testimony of a confession to murder. A failed polygraph on record from 1960. Two separate identifications tying the same man to a nearly identical assault weeks before the killing. A documented letter describing an actual church cover-up plan. And still, in 2004, 44 years after Irene Garza's murder, the case goes nowhere, because the sitting district attorney, by his own account at the time, didn't believe there was enough to secure a conviction and chose not to push it further. Garza would later say publicly that he simply hadn't found evidence that met his own bar for prosecution, despite everything the two priests had just told investigators under oath. Before we get to how this case finally broke, there's one detail that deserves its own moment, because it shows exactly how far the church's protection of Feit actually extended over the decades he spent as a free man. After the accusations in 1960, rather than facing any lasting consequence, Feit was sent to a treatment center set up specifically for priests dealing with behavioral or psychological problems. And instead of that being the end of his standing within the church, he eventually worked his way into a supervisory role there. In that position, records would later show, Feit personally helped clear and relocate another troubled priest, a man named James Porter, who would go on to be accused of molesting as many as 100 children across multiple states. Sit with that for a second. A man privately suspected by his own superiors of murdering a young woman was within the very same religious institution, later put in a position of trust over the fate of other priests accused of preying on children. It's a detail that didn't come out until decades later, and it's a grim illustration of exactly how an institution built around protecting its own reputation can quietly let one problem create the conditions for the next one. That pattern, internal protection over external accountability, is precisely the argument prosecutors would eventually build their entire case around when Feit finally faced a jury. For over a decade more, the case sits exactly where it sat since 1960. Everyone believes they know who did it, and nobody with the authority to prosecute is willing to act. That finally changes when Ricardo Rodriguez challenges Irene Garza for the district attorney's office, wins, and reopens the file almost immediately after taking office. In February 2016, Rodriguez secures what his predecessor never could, a formal grand jury indictment against John Feit for the murder of Irene Garza. Feit, now 83 years old, is arrested outside his apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, and held pending extradition back to Texas. 56 years after the murder, 56 years after that letter, that polygraph, those two identical assaults, that failed 2004 grand jury, a man finally gets arrested for what almost everyone in McAllen had quietly believed for over half a century. John Feit's murder trial finally begins in late 2017, 57 years after Irene Garza died. He's 85 years old, requires a walker to move through the courtroom, and sits through 5 days of testimony as prosecutors lay out a case built almost entirely on decades-old circumstantial evidence, since no DNA or direct physical proof survived from 1960. The very first witness the state calls is Daryl Davis, the reporter-turned-lawyer, who testifies under oath about that off-the-record meeting decades earlier, telling jurors plainly that the district attorney at the time knew Feit killed Irene Garza and that the church knew it too, and had promised to move him to a monastery in exchange for silence. Two men who'd found Irene's purse back in 1960 also take the stand, describing for a modern jury exactly what that untouched purse looked like, lying in an empty field. Jurors are shown Irene's actual petticoat, purse, and skirt from that night, entered into evidence more than half a century after they were first collected. Beatrice Garcia takes the stand too, telling jurors about that unsettling encounter in the weeks before the murder, when Feit stopped her on the street and asked to photograph her in black clothing near a cemetery. Testimony prosecutors used to paint a picture of a man whose behavior toward young women had troubled people well before anyone connected him to a killing. Assistant District Attorney Michael Garza, no relation to the victim, tells jurors directly that the Catholic Church and local law enforcement colluded to protect Feit from prosecution in exchange for the church disciplining him privately. He reminds jurors of the Guerra assault conviction, testimony from other women in the community who'd had unsettling encounters with Feit, and the fact that the church moved him out of the valley within months of the murder. In his closing argument, Garza doesn't mince words, asking jurors directly whether what they're trying to convince their own hearts of is different from what their minds already know is true, telling them to use their common sense and, in his words, open the eyes of your heart to find John Feit guilty of murder. The defense, led by attorney Rene Flores, mounts exactly the argument you'd expect against a case with no forensic proof. He tells jurors there is no physical evidence whatsoever, no fingerprints, no blood, no DNA, that affirmatively connects Feit to Irene Garza's death in any way. He challenges the reliability of a small photo slide viewer investigators say was recovered near the canal back in 1960, questioning whether it can really be tied to Feit at all after 57 years. And he leans hard on the passage of time itself, asking jurors to weigh whether decades-old memories from elderly witnesses recalling a single conversation from half a century earlier can really support a murder conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. In his own closing argument, Flores tells the jury almost the exact inverse of what the prosecution just said, warning them not to let their hearts make findings that their minds, guided by common sense about the lack of hard evidence, shouldn't support. After 5 days of testimony, the jury deliberates for 6.5 hours. On December 7, 2017, they return their verdict, guilty of murder. The next day, prosecutors ask for a sentence of 57 years. 1 year, they argue, for every year Feit walked free. The jury goes further. They sentence him to life in prison. In the courtroom, Irene's family members embrace the prosecutors and the police chief, who'd helped reopen the case decades after most people had given up hope of ever seeing this moment. Feit's legal team immediately files an appeal, arguing that the trial court wrongly admitted certain hearsay testimony about Irene's own stated plans and fears in the days before her death, statements about her that were relayed secondhand, which his attorneys argued didn't meet the legal exceptions Texas evidence law normally requires. They separately argued that circumstantial, decades-old witness memory simply couldn't meet the legal bar for a murder conviction, emphasizing the total absence of direct physical proof, like DNA or an eyewitness placing Feit at the canal itself, and suggesting the prosecution had leaned too heavily on recollections that were, by that point, well over 50 years old and vulnerable to the ordinary decay of human memory. They also point to his advanced age and declining health, including his need for a walker, as a factor they argued should weigh in favor of relief, though Texas appellate courts don't typically overturn convictions on health grounds alone without an accompanying constitutional violation. That appeal is never resolved. On February 11, 2020, John Feit is found unresponsive in his cell at the Estelle unit in Huntsville, Texas, and is pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after, at 87 years old, from cardiac arrest. His conviction stands as the final word from a jury, But because he died before Texas's appellate courts finished reviewing his case, the legal process itself never technically reached a final conclusion. Prosecutors were unambiguous about what they believed mattered most. Hidalgo County District Attorney Ricardo Rodriguez told reporters at the time that Feit's death didn't change the outcome that counted, and that he was happy to know there was closure for Irene Garza's family after everything they'd endured. He specifically thanked the family for their patience through decades most people would have given up on entirely. Irene Garza's case had taken 57 years to reach a jury, and less than 3 more for the man convicted of killing her to die still legally fighting the verdict. A jury of 12 ordinary Texans, delivered 57 years after her murder, got the last word that mattered. So who actually knew? How many church officials read that letter, or wrote one just like it, and said nothing? How many years did a sitting district attorney sit on 2 independent confessions before deciding not to act? How many decades of an entire family's life were quietly spent waiting for an institution to stop protecting one of its own? How many other women did Feit approach, follow, or frighten in the years between the Guerra assault and Irene's murder, whose stories never made it into any police file at all? And how many other cases, in how many other small towns, followed this exact same shape? A respected institution, a convenient silence, and a family left to wonder for decades whether anyone in power ever actually cared? Irene Garza's case didn't stay unsolved because there wasn't enough evidence. It stayed unsolved because, for 56 years, the people who had that evidence decided protecting an institution mattered more than telling the truth. It took a change in local politics, 2 former priests willing to break decades of silence, and 1 new district attorney willing to actually use a grand jury to finally get a 25-year-old schoolteacher the verdict she deserved, even if it came 57 years too late for her to ever see it, and even if the man convicted of taking her life died 3 years later without the legal process ever fully finishing its course. What happened in McAllen in 1960 wasn't a failure of evidence. It was a choice, made by people with names and titles and reputations to protect, to let a young woman's murder become an inconvenience to be managed rather than a crime to be solved. It took 56 years, 2 brave former priests, and 1 prosecutor willing to actually use the grand jury system as intended to finally undo that choice.